Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter by Seth Grahame-Smith is a well-written pseudo-biography based around the notion that old Abe was actually a vampire hunter. It's not an alternate universe so much as a fantastical interpretation of history, based on the premise of Abe's vampire friend Henry bringing Abe's secret journals to the author, and him constructing a completely 100% true biographical account of Abe as a vampire hunter, complete with humorous footnotes and photographs. The author does a good job of integrating the fantastic narrative with the real-world history to create an entertaining story of sufficient plausibility for the suspension of disbelief. From a political standpoint, it has received praise for its association of literal monsters with the villains of history, the slavers of the American South. But it suffers in its use of the white savior figure and poor treatment of female characters. It is also flawed in its negative treatment of the concept of immortality, while ultimately turning its back on its own philosophy. ALVH is often cited as the way to do vampires in a way respectful to minorities, in contrast to depictions like that in True Blood. True Blood depicts its vampires as the latest minority to show up in American politics, demanding equal rights and respectful treatment, as a way of commentating on bigotry relating to real-world racism and homophobia. For as much as its vampires are simply a people with its own good and bad elements, while mostly being about people legitimately trying to unlive as American citizens, this is an effective narrative that is respectful to real-world minorities. However, it becomes clear that the bad elements are indicative of the fundamental malicious nature of vampire kind, that vampires have their own authority structure, no intention of assimilation, its own secret agenda, and an evil religion that leads them to try to subjugate humanity, which is pretty much illustrative of what real-world bigots think about minorities. In contrast, ALVH associates the malicious nature of vampires with slavers, and the Confederacy's agenda to keep slavery a beloved practice, as it gives vampires a steady stream of victims. The sneaky, secretive nature of vampires is used in a way that effectively challenges racism through its association with racists and the system, while the minority in question is kept as an innocent victim of evil bigots. I will agree that this is the best way to depict a vampire conspiracy, however, it's not the best way to write an anti-racist book, given the focus on white protagonists acting in the role of white savior. For a book ostensibly about fighting racism, Black people are barely in it and have no agency in the plot, at least not until the very, very end with a brief cameo from Martin Luther King. The book is all about Abe and his white friends fighting white vampire slavers and their white human slaver associates, / goons. Black people essentially take the role of damsel in distress, just being there and helpless while the hero goes after the man twirling his mustache. I kind of feel like the book should have taken place from the point of view of a black person. The fantastical nature of the antagonists aside, all claims of needing to match historical accuracy go out the window when the book's fundamental premise is that our understanding of history is radically flawed, and all sorts of wacky stuff happen behind the scenes. The fact that the book centers on Abe at all is flawed. The man has been highly romanticized as a larger-than-life human rights advocate who freed the slaves from the evil Confederates, and then was tragically killed by a surviving evildoer. He was actually kind of a tyrant who arrested people who wrote unflattering newspaper articles about him, and the kind of stuff people are mad at George W. Bush for. Yeah, he cared about abolition to some degree, but it was less about respecting black people and wanting them to achieve the rights and respect of white people, and more about ending slavery to save face, and then sending the black people back to Africa. His remembered action of freeing the slaves only applied to slaves under Confederate rule, as a means of antagonizing the South in the middle of the war. The book very briefly mentions that he doesn't free the slaves in states under Union control, but no one ever focuses on that part. He was a big racist who casually used the N-word, and the best you can say about him is that he did something that turned out good as a political move in his conflict with the Confederates over territory. He probably didn't deserve assassination, but he wasn't a nice guy, let alone this awesome human rights advocate that mainstream media paints him as. The figure has largely been romanticized as a cult of personality figure by the American government to clean up the messiness of Civil War history and to suggest that the United States has been respectful of black people since the Civil War, and that the racist slavery supporters are fundamentally anti-American, instead of the American government owning that bad history. Abe in the book shares that romanticization and is really cleaned up in order to appeal to modern American views of race. He really feels like a modern white guy dropped into this historical setting, somehow not absorbing the racism of his peers, and opposing the status quo of the bygone era. You know what? I can buy that. This is a wacky book about Abe not being the guy that history knows him as. Why not make him better than history? Why not? The problem is that once we establish that this Abe is a better man, there is no excuse for any of the flaws with this Abe's personality. You can't just say, oh, the Abe of history did that. This is a different Abe, remember? At one point, after Abe has retired from vampire hunting, his old friend Henry recruits him into the Union, an alliance of rogue vampires who oppose the Confederate vampires.
Who has disturbed Ulysses' grand slumber?
Henry explains that the southern vampires intend to make war and take over the country. Abe doesn't care. He's retired. Someone else will fight the vampires. Henry then explains that the Confederate vampires won't stop at owning black people. They'll eventually enslave the white people too, and then there will be a country of vampire masters and human slaves. And suddenly Abe is motivated to destroy vampire evil. Why couldn't the enslavement of black people be enough? There is already ample reason to oppose Confederate vampires. The fact that it needs white people to be treated like black people is racist on the part of Abe, and I suspect of the author. The knowledge that Confederate vampires will eventually do this should be treated like an unfortunate eventuality, while focusing on the bad going on in the present. Perhaps like the treatment of the evil of the Morlocks in the Time Machine, where it doesn't matter that the Earth will eventually be lifeless, because the situation with the Morlocks and the Eloi matters enough for its placement in time. There's also a highly stereotypical Romani character thrown into the backstory of John Wilkes Booth, just to add atmosphere. The character is a standard fortune teller, whose prophecy about Booth's death turns out to be true. The character is only referred to with the popular ethnic slur. While rampant racism is appropriate for the day, the fact that all of the quotations erase the N-word and replace it with the word blacks in brackets really gives no excuse for the use of the G-word here. In the context of the premise, the author character is at least supposed to be trying to be respectful to racial minorities. The book is also sexist. There are no strong, respected female characters, only peripheral women who influence Abe, largely through their tragic deaths at the hands of vampires. That is to say, women in refrigerators. And his wife, who serves primarily as the mother of his children. She then goes mad, they grow distant, and her son has her committed for having hallucinations of her dead husband being alive, that were surely real sightings of her husband as a vampire, not taking any responsibility for his wife's well-being. There's also a lovesick girl in Henry's backstory, whose father forces her to travel against her will to the colonies, and she is largely treated as an annoying teenager eaten by vampires for the sake of drama. The whole of the story is conducted by guys, men affecting history in between the lines of recorded history, and it's fundamentally a white guy fantasy story. The very nature of the story in twisting history and altering characters to be more likable really gives the author no excuse whatsoever. Finally, the book promotes the idea that death is a good thing, not just a tragic eventuality. Henry discusses vampire nature as fundamentally flawed because death is needed to give life meaning in his view. He says that humans live fulfilling lives because they have an end, and the sense of urgency is what gives life meaning. Vampires don't have fulfilling unlives because they eventually run out of things to do and commit suicide. Abe then waxes poetic about human superiority because of death. That's just anti-intellectual coping with an unavoidable tragedy. Death is not good at all. It would seem that vampires are just really unimaginative creatures if they run out of things to do. At barest, they could take up a hobby, like insulting everyone in the universe in alphabetical order. Henry's suggestions for vampire activities are incredibly self-centered and based in mean-spirited power fantasies. If vampires devoted their energy to helping people, they would never get bored, and their actions would actually mean something. Bizarrely, the book fails to comment on this theme, and ends with Henry and Abe as vampire buddies, smiling as they watch Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. But it doesn't give a good reason for it, past a general appreciation of the two's friendship. Henry and Abe don't explain why they changed their minds, and the book is ultimately still in support of the depiction of death as a good thing. Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter is an entertaining read and well-researched, but it has major flaws that detract from my enjoyment. While certainly better than True Blood, it suffers in its depiction of the struggle against racism as about good white men versus evil white men, with the victimized black people as persons without agency caught in the middle. Final scene with Henry and Abe observing Martin Luther King is less about the rights of black people as it is Henry and Abe enjoying the results of their own little project, respecting black people in a diminutive, my little people is all grown up sort of way. I was left wondering why the story wasn't about Martin Luther King as the vampire hunter. I mean, the man was homophobic, but he was sure better than Abraham Lincoln.